Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to actually talk about both clauses 1 and 2 and some calls on in this particular part of the debate. The first of those is to talk about clause 1, the title, the Returning Offenders Management and Information Act. And Mr. Chair, it's quite clear that in terms of this title, the information bit is the focus of the bill. So we've had a number of contributions from members as we worked our way through parts 1 and 2 about the way in which information is provided. We've had amendments proposed to try and ensure that New Zealand public can feel secure that all the information that the New Zealand Police and the Department of Corrections need is being provided. The jury is out on that. We've certainly seen up to now some considerable difficulties about the provision of information. I even heard the Minister of Justice on the radio this morning, unable to tell New Zealanders where the first load of people coming from Australia would land on their aeroplane. Didn't know. You said, didn't know, yes. Well, that's a good guess, Ruth Dyson, that it'll be at an airport. That narrows it down a little bit, doesn't it? So it's still clear that there are difficulties and issues with the amount of information that's flowing to the government. We also had the Minister of Justice tell us that she didn't find out about this until February. Well, that's hopeless. Clearly her sources of information are very poor. The New Zealand media was reporting it in January. The legislation was passed in Australia in December, so the flow of information to the New Zealand government has not been good. The Minister blamed this morning on the radio, blamed the fact that this piece of legislation is now being rushed through under urgency on the fact that she didn't get the information about the prisoners that was required to draft this legislation until September. That's just ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. And if that is actually accurate, that the Australian government has been withholding that information from the Minister of Justice, well, that speaks volumes about the poor state of the relationship between New Zealand and Australia under this government, that the Minister of Justice hasn't even got access to the information required to draft this legislation until September. I actually don't believe that, Mr. Chair, by the way. I think that it's just a case of the Minister finding an excuse for having dragged her feet on this issue from December last year. So the bill's title, that this is about the Returning Offenders Management and Information Act, yes, it's about information. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the failure of this government to get on top of the flow of information on this issue, I believe, has been writ large by the Minister over the last couple of weeks. But the main part of the title that I want to focus on in this call is around the question of management. So the title is the Returning Offenders Management and Information. And in the House last night, the Minister of Justice told us that we shouldn't go looking in this piece of legislation for the way in which the offenders who are returning to New Zealand will be managed in terms of their reintegration. She told us last night that this was a justice bill, she said. This is not a bill about reintegration. Well, just pause on that thought for a moment. Isn't that what it's all about? When somebody actually goes into prison, or in this case returns to New Zealand as a person who has been imprisoned and ends up in an effective parole-like arrangement, isn't the management of them all about reintegration and rehabilitation? That's what this bill should have been about. To the credit of the officials, that's what they thought this bill should be about. They wrote in the regulatory impact statement and in the advice that we've now seen in this House all about the importance of reintegration. They gave paragraphs of material to it. They put it in the objectives, which should have been what this legislation ended up being about. And then the Minister of Justice stands up in this House last night and says, don't come looking in this legislation for information about what's going to happen in terms of accommodation, in terms of employment, in terms of health outcomes. Every member of this House who represents an electorate in a large town or city has dealt with a prisoner who exits the prison system and falls through the gaps. That's right, Mr Henare. In my office in Wellington Central, I have prisoners who come in, they've spent their $300 on the steps to freedom within the first 24 hours and they don't have anywhere to live. And we have to work with them because the government decided not to fund the Prisoners' Aid and Rehabilitation Society properly anymore. We have to work with them to find their way forward. Imagine being somebody who comes to New Zealand under these arrangements and has no backstop, hasn't lived here for 45 years. They've got nothing, and the Minister of Justice says, well, don't come looking in this legislation for anything that's actually going to really help with, to quote the title of the bill, Mr Chair, to quote the title of the bill, management of returning offenders. The Minister says, don't go looking in this bill to see if we're actually going to sort out their accommodation. Kelvin Davis raised this in the House last night. What happens when those people come in? I heard the Minister say this morning, oh, they'll be met at the airport and they'll be asked, have you got somewhere to live? Have you got somewhere to live? Oh, I don't know, maybe I do. I'll go and stay with my cousin who I used to play with when we were 4 years old, which is the last time I saw them. We know that information that's provided in those moments is often wrong or misleading. Answers are given by people to get out of the way. They don't want to deal with any of these officials anymore. Yes, I've got somewhere to live. Yep, that's a satisfactory answer. Box ticked, away we go. What about the health outcomes and the health issues? Mr Chair, there will be significant mental health issues involved, not only, I might say, potentially for those who are the returning prisoners and offenders, but also for others in the community who might know them or have some experience of dealing with them in some way, or they or their families. Yeah. Mental health issues are one of the biggest issues in terms of reintegration, the support that's required to be able to become part of a community. And again, the needs are greater here than they would be for returning released prisoners in New Zealand, because the lack of whānau support, the lack of family around, actually will make those mental health issues even bigger. Where's that in this bill? Where in the bill that is about the management of returning offenders? That's what the title of the bill says, the management of returning offenders. And the Minister says, don't come looking in this bill for how we will actually manage them in terms of their mental health, in terms of their accommodation needs, in terms of how they will actually reintegrate into the community. This is a perfunctory response, a rushed response, because the government mucked around, failed to heed the warning signs coming out of the Australian lawmaking process, and as a result, that's not here in this bill. And I actually think it was David Clendon from the Greens last night who, when he got up and he spoke about, as you followed through the advice of the officials, the objectives that they put up, and then you found your way to the purpose of the legislation, it lost its focus. It suddenly became this very functionary piece of legislation about information and the Parole Act and its relationship with the Parole Act. So the title of this bill, Mr Chair, to my mind is actually a misnomer. This is not about the management of these returning offenders. It's in fact about the mismanagement of these returning offenders and the failure of this government to have in place the kind of reintegration and rehabilitation regime that's now needed. These prisoners shouldn't be coming back to New Zealand. These released prisoners and released offenders should not be coming back to New Zealand. They should be going to Australia where their family is. The government's failed in its advocacy in that regard. Now it's doubling up on the failure, Mr Chair, by failing to put in place a proper reintegration program. I just want to briefly, in the remaining time to me, Mr Chair, speak about Clause 2, the commencement date, and the fact that this comes into force on the day which it receives its royal assent. That will probably be today or tomorrow at the very latest. That is too late. That is a failure by this government. The fact that this will come into force, here we are on the 17th of November 2015, that this comes into force. It was December 2014 when the Australian Parliament passed this legislation. I guarantee you, Mr Chair, if we look into the cables that emerge out of the New Zealand High Commission in Canberra, there would have been one in December that said a big change has just happened under Australian law about what happens to people who have served time in prison or who are regarded as being of bad character. I guarantee the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade officials were up to the task of doing that. Perhaps the Minister had gone off for a Christmas break Perhaps she wasn't focused on it. Come January, there were articles in the newspaper. They will have been reported to the Minister, but the Minister failed to recognise those. Tony Abbott came over here for the one-day cricket game between New Zealand and Australia, which New Zealand won. Kane Williamson hitting a 6 with New Zealand 9 down. I was there. I saw John Key and Tony Abbott meeting. Apparently that was when they finally got around to first discussing this in February. John Key, perhaps in the euphoria of the Cricket World Cup, forgot when he got back to Wellington to say, you know what, Amy Adams, we should actually be drafting up some legislation now, so we're ready on this. Didn't bother to do that. Sat around and waited for information to come from Australia, and then finally gets around to introducing a bill about 9 months later. That's hopeless, Mr Speaker. It's a failure.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
It's relatively unusual for me to take